Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley, the place where stories linger long after the lights go out. Tonight, we prepared chilling tales paired with the soothing sound of rain to ignite your imagination and make your heart race. If you feel the cold creeping in, tap that like button. It helps keep the shadows alive. Tell us in the comments where you're listening from or share the scariest moment that sent shivers down your spine. Don't forget to subscribe. You wouldn't want to miss what lurks in the darkness ahead. Have you ever seen them? That was the question I couldn't shake, the one that kept circling in my mind every time I glanced across the street. The house had been empty for as long as I could remember, its windows dark, its yard unkempt. But then, one day, new neighbors moved in. At least, that's what the real estate sign said. But I had never seen them. It's the little things that start to get to you, the way the house seemed so still. The curtains never moved, even when the wind was strong. The lights were always off, or at least, that's how it appeared. I didn't think much of it at first. New neighbors often took their time to settle in. But something felt off. The house seemed too quiet. And then it happened. One evening, I was sitting in my living room watching TV when I noticed a flicker of light from across the street. It was faint at first, like a bulb struggling to stay lit. I glanced out the window, expecting to see the usual emptiness of the house. But there, in the window, just for a moment, I saw something. A shadow. A figure. Standing motionless, facing me. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just the light, playing tricks. But the longer I stared, the clearer the figure became. It wasn't moving, just standing there, watching me. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks. But then, the light flickered again. This time, it stayed on longer. The figure in the window, it didn't shift, didn't look away. I couldn't look away either. What if they were watching me back? The idea sent a cold shiver down my spine. I got from my couch, my feet hesitant, as if the floor beneath me wasn't mine anymore. I tried to reason with myself. It's just a shadow. Maybe someone in the house turned on the light and didn't realize the curtain was still drawn. It's fine. But the thought didn't ease my growing sense of unease. I told myself I had to go see. I had to know what was going on. My curiosity was eating at me, gnawing, urging me to cross that boundary. With each step towards the door, I could feel the weight of the silence pressing down harder. The air felt thick, almost suffocating. The usual sounds of the neighborhood, the chirping of crickets, the hum of distant traffic, had all but vanished. It was as if the world had paused. I opened the door cautiously, stepping out into the cold evening. The house across the street was silent again, just as it had been before. But now, I wasn't so sure if I had imagined the figure. Was it real? Or had it been a product of my imagination? The wind picked up, carrying the faintest whisper of something wrong. Something was off about the air, the atmosphere. Something was waiting. And just then, I heard it, faint but distinct, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. No. It wasn't the wind. It was coming from the house. Something was walking. I held my breath. Please, no one's there. I was pleading now, hoping for a rational explanation. I watched. I waited. The footsteps stopped. Then came the sound of a door creaking open. Very slowly. My heart raced, hammering in my chest. I wanted to run, to turn away and never look back. But I couldn't. The fear rooted me to the spot. And then, from behind the door, I saw it, just a glimmer at first. The slightest movement. A shadow, and it was getting closer. I stepped back, heart pounding, pulse loud in my ears. The hairs on my neck stood on end. Every instinct in me screamed to get away, to run, but my feet stayed frozen. I should have never looked. But I had. And now, I couldn't escape the fear that had started to grow inside me, clawing its way into my thoughts. I had to know. Who or what was in that house? I stood there, my breath shallow, trying to make sense of what I had just seen or thought I had seen. The figure behind the door, the footsteps, none of it made sense. I could feel the cold creeping into my bones as I stared at the house across the street, its windows now dark again. Had I imagined it all? The thought gnawed at me. But there was something, an instinct deep within me, that told me I hadn't. The house, with its peeling paint and overgrown garden, seemed as still and lifeless as it always had. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. That something, where someone was inside, watching. I turned around slowly, walking back into my house, though I barely remembered how I got there. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of everything. I needed to figure this out. I needed to know if there really was someone living there, or if it was something else entirely. The next day, I found myself sitting at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee growing cold in front of me. The events of the previous evening kept replaying in my mind like a broken record. What did I see? Was it real? I kept telling myself it was nothing, that it was just the darkness playing tricks on me, but I knew deep down it was something more. I glanced out the window again. The house across the street was still. Nothing unusual. No lights flickering. No strange movements in the window. Yet, the unease in my chest hadn't gone away. In fact, it had grown. I decided I needed to get closer. I needed to see for myself what was really going on in that house. It was the only way to ease the constant anxiety gnawing at me. I grabbed my jacket and headed out, my feet crunching on the frosty ground as I crossed the street. My hands trembled, but I forced myself to walk steadily, my eyes fixed on the house in front of me. It looked the same, too quiet, too still. But now that I was standing right in front of it, I could feel it. The air around the house was thick, almost oppressive. There was something wrong here, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. I walked around the side of the house, hoping to find some sign of life, some clue that would make sense of all this. As I rounded the corner, I froze. There was a window, a small one, just barely above the ground, where I could see a faint light inside. It wasn't much, just a dull glow, but it was there. And it seemed to be moving. I leaned in closer, my breath fogging up the glass. And then I saw it, a shadow, moving across the room. It was too quick to catch clearly, but it was there. I could feel my heart race as I stepped back from the window, the air now feeling too tight, too heavy. I shouldn't have been here. I should have turned around and walked away. But something, some pull, some desire to understand, kept me rooted to the spot. A sound interrupted my thoughts, a creak. It came from inside the house. Slow. Intentional. As if someone, or something, was coming closer to the door. I froze, my entire body tensing. I shouldn't be here. I knew that now. But I couldn't leave. Not yet. I stood in the shadows, waiting. listening. And then, from inside, I heard something else. A voice. Soft. Barely a whisper. I see you. The words sent a chill down my spine, and I stumbled backward, my foot catching on something. I fell, the ground scraping against my palms, but I didn't move to get up. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be. But the voice, it was real. The house wasn't empty. And whatever was in there was fully aware of me. I scrambled to my feet, heart hammering in my chest, and looked up at the window again. The faint light had disappeared, but the figure, that shadow, was still there. I could see it now, standing in the window, unmoving, watching me. I had to leave. I turned and ran, my legs aching with every step, but the sensation that I was being watched didn't leave. It never would. When I reached my front door, I slammed it shut behind me and leaned against it, gasping for breath. My hands shook and my mind raced. Had I really heard a voice? Was it real, or had my fear finally started to play tricks on me? The house across the street was still. Silent. But I knew now, more than ever, that I wasn't alone. And neither was the house. The question lingered in my mind like a dark cloud. What did they want? I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me back into my house. The silence felt wrong now, too heavy, as though the walls themselves were closing in on me. Every creak of the floorboards under my feet seemed amplified. Every breeze that passed through the cracks in the window felt like a whisper, like someone, or something, was trying to make itself known. I couldn't sleep. I hadn't been able to sleep properly since the night I saw the figure in the window, but now it was worse. The dark circles under my eyes were growing deeper, and I couldn't keep the unease out of my mind. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, that I was overreacting, that my fear had taken control. But the voice, I see you, kept echoing in my head. That wasn't just a trick of the mind. It couldn't have been. I couldn't go back to that house. I couldn't face whatever was in there. But every time I looked out the window, I couldn't help myself. The house across the street was always there, standing in the same stillness. I knew it was waiting for something. Or maybe it was waiting for me. The next evening, I found myself at my window again, watching, unable to look away. The sun had set, and the street lamps cast long, distorted shadows over the houses. The house across the street seemed to absorb the light, becoming a darker silhouette against the fading sky. The windows were black, empty, or so it seemed. But I couldn't stop myself from staring at it. My hands were trembling as I gripped the edge of the windowsill. I glanced away for a moment, just long enough to take a breath and try to steady myself. That's when I heard it, soft at first, like a sigh carried by the wind. But then it grew louder. The unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the house across the street. My heart began to race again, pounding in my chest as I slowly turned back to the window. I couldn't see anything, not clearly. The shadows in the house were too thick, too deep. But the footsteps, they kept coming. Closer. Every step was like a drumbeat, loud in my ears. I wanted to look away, to hide, to escape the terror creeping up my spine. But I couldn't. I was paralyzed, stuck in place by some invisible force. Then, the door. The door to the house creaked open, just like before, slowly, agonizingly slow. And for a brief moment, I saw a figure in the doorway, just a silhouette, but enough for me to know it wasn't human. It wasn't human. I gasped, stumbling back from the window, my breath coming in short, frantic bursts. My mind was spinning. What was it? What was happening? I didn't know if I should call someone, but who would believe me? Who would believe that the house across the street, that house, was alive in some way, hiding something so unnatural? I pulled myself together, trying to breathe through the panic, but it wasn't working. I felt like I was suffocating, like the walls of my own home were closing in on me. I needed to leave. I needed to get out. I grabbed my coat from the back of the door and rushed outside without thinking. The night air hit me like a slap in the face, the chill of it grounding me, but it did nothing to ease the dread I felt. I didn't even know where I was going. I just had to move to get away from the house across the street. But as I stepped off the porch, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A voice. Low. Raspy. Don't run. I froze in place, my heart thundering in my ears. It came from behind me, so close I could almost feel the breath on my neck. I whipped around, but there was nothing there. Just the darkness of the street, the silent houses, and the distant hum of the city. My stomach turned. My legs were shaking, and I had to brace myself against the railing of my porch to keep from collapsing. The voice, "Don't run," had been real. It wasn't in my head. I wasn't imagining it. I turned to face the house across the street, the one I had been avoiding. But this time, I didn't look through the window. I didn't wait for the figure to appear. This time, I walked toward it. I didn't know why. Something inside me urged me to. Maybe I was trying to prove to myself that it was all in my head, that I wasn't going crazy. Maybe I was hoping to see something, anything, that would make sense of all this. I crossed the street slowly, my footsteps echoing in the quiet night. The closer I got to the house, the more the air seemed to thicken, like it was pressing down on me. The house loomed larger with every step, its windows like black eyes, staring down at me. I reached the front gate and stopped. My hand hovered over the rusted metal. The house seemed to draw me in, like it was calling me closer, pulling me toward it. But I hesitated, my fingers trembling. The door creaked open again. And this time, the figure stepped into the doorway. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. It was real. The figure was tall, impossibly tall, with long, spindly limbs that bent in unnatural angles. Its face was hidden, but I could see the shape of it, twisted, wrong. The longer I stared, the more I could see. Its movements were slow, deliberate, as if savoring the fear it was causing. I wanted to run. My body screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. And then it spoke. "Come closer," it whispered, the voice cold and hollow. "You've been waiting for me, haven't you?" I felt a coldness seep into my skin, a chill that went deeper than the night air. Every instinct told me to turn and run, but something inside me, something darker, told me to stay. And I couldn't move. The figure in the doorway stepped forward, its eyes, if they could be called eyes, fixed on me. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it disappeared back into the house. I stood there, my breath caught in my throat. What was it? Why had it come? What did it want with me? I backed away slowly, feeling the weight of the silence pressing down on me once again. I had made a terrible mistake by coming here. But it was too late now. The house knew me. It was watching me. And there was no escape. I didn't know how long I stood there, staring at the empty doorway. My legs felt like they were made of stone, too heavy to move. The darkness around me seemed to press in closer, suffocating, the air thick with something I couldn't quite name, like it was alive, watching, waiting. I finally forced myself to turn around, my heart hammering in my chest. I couldn't stay here any longer. I had to get away, to go back to my house, lock myself inside, and pretend none of this was real. But as I began to walk back toward my front gate, I heard it. A sound. Soft at first, almost like a whisper, coming from the direction of the house. Come back. I froze mid-step. The voice wasn't just in my head. It was real. It wasn't distant, like before. It was right there, as though it was standing behind me, breathing down my neck. My heart skipped a beat. I spun around, but the house across the street was silent again. No lights. No movement. Just the same dark silhouette against the night sky. I took a cautious step back toward my house, my breath shallow, my mind racing. My skin prickled, every nerve on high alert. I wanted to go inside, to escape into the safety of my own home, but something I couldn't understand, held me in place. It was as if the house across the street had a hold on me, a pull I couldn't fight. Suddenly, I heard a faint sound coming from the front yard of the house. A soft crunch of gravel underfoot. I wasn't alone. My pulse quickened, and I took another step back, my eyes darting between the house and my own. Every part of me screamed to run, to get out of there, but my body refused to obey. The chill in the air grew colder, and I could almost feel something watching me from the shadows of the yard. Something was there. Then, a figure emerged from the darkness, a man, or at least, he appeared to be one. He was tall, impossibly tall, his limbs stretched and unnaturally thin, like a creature that had been twisted and warped by the very air around it. His face was hidden in shadow, but I could see his eyes, shiny, black, and empty, like two voids that sucked in all the light. "Why do you run?" His voice was soft but insistent, each word feeling like a weight pressing down on me. I couldn't speak. My throat was dry, my mind clouded with fear. I took a step back, then another, my feet moving on their own as I backed toward the gate of my yard. The figure didn't move. He just stood there, watching, his head tilted slightly to one side, like he was studying me. I could hear the faint rustling of leaves, the wind whispering through the trees, but everything else was silent. My pulse pounded in my ears, drying out everything else. "Come closer," he said again, his voice a low murmur, like a lure, a trap. "You know you want to." I shook my head, unable to find my voice. My legs moved without thinking, and I was backing away, stumbling toward my door. The figure didn't follow, but his eyes never left me. I could feel them on my skin, even as I turned and ran up the steps to my porch. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely breathe. I slammed the door shut behind me, locking it, bolting it, and I leaned against it, my hands shaking. I didn't know what that thing was, or why it was after me, but I couldn't deny it anymore. It was real. Whatever was in that house was real. And it was watching me. I couldn't stop thinking about the figure, about the coldness in his eyes, about the way he spoke, like he already knew me. I stumbled into the living room, collapsing onto the couch. My mind was racing, the thoughts tumbling over each other faster than I could keep up. I had to figure this out. I had to stop it, whatever it was, before it consumed me. But then, there was something else. Something that hadn't occurred to me before. Something far worse. The house across the street had been abandoned for so long. So how could there be anyone in it now? My breath caught in my throat as realization hit me. If there was someone, or something in that house, then it had been waiting for me. The whole time. From the moment I first noticed the house, from the first flicker of light in the window. It hadn't been watching me by accident. It had been waiting for me to notice. The thought sent a cold shiver down my spine. I didn't know what to do. There were no answers. No help. No escape. But one thing was certain. Whatever was in that house, it had already claimed me. I sank deeper into the couch, my mind in a fog of fear and confusion. There was nowhere to run. Nowhere to hide. And I knew that it was only a matter of time before it came for me again. The question wasn't whether I could escape. It was whether I would survive. As I sat there, trying to catch my breath, I heard it again. A whisper, low and clear. Come back. You belong to us. It wasn't just a voice anymore. It was a presence, a dark, suffocating weight in the room with me. I could feel it, pressing against the walls, crawling under my skin. I wasn't alone. Not anymore. And I couldn't escape. I didn't know if I was going crazy or if the house had somehow invaded my mind, but I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to confront it. I had to face whatever was waiting in that house. But as I sat there, the light in the window across the street flickered again. And then it went out completely. The darkness outside was now absolute. No flickers of light. No movement. Just silence. It was the kind of silence that gripped you, that filled every corner of your mind, suffocating you from within. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, a constant drumbeat of dread. Every small noise, the creak of the floor beneath my feet, the subtle hum of the refrigerator, felt like it was being amplified, echoing off the walls, like the house was closing in on me. I stood there, rooted to the spot, my mind swirling with thoughts I couldn't make sense of. The figure in the yard. The voice. The constant watching. It was all becoming too much. Too real. I turned back to the window, my eyes searching the shadows for any sign of movement. There was nothing. Just the empty space between my house and the one across the street. But the stillness only made it worse. The emptiness felt too unnatural. I glanced at the clock, just past midnight. It was far too late for anything to make sense. But I knew I couldn't wait any longer. I had to go over there. I had to see for myself what was happening. I had to confront whatever that thing was before it came for me again. With every step I took toward the door, I felt the weight of fear grow heavier. My hands were slick with sweat, my legs shaking beneath me, but I pushed forward. I couldn't let it win. I couldn't let the house swallow me whole. As I stepped outside, the cold air hit me like a slap to the face. The night was thick, the air heavy with that same oppressive stillness. I hesitated for just a moment at the edge of my porch, my eyes scanning the darkness. The street was empty, nothing but the faintest outline of the house across the way. It felt like I was moving through a dream, every step slow, deliberate, as if the very ground beneath me was trying to pull me back. I had to force myself to keep moving forward. There was no turning back now. The closer I got to the house, the more it seemed to loom over me. The walls felt like they were closing in, the windows dark and hollow. It looked like a place forgotten by time, abandoned to the point of decay, yet somehow still alive, like it had a presence, an energy that clung to the air. I reached the front gate, my fingers trembling as I pushed it open. It creaked loudly, a harsh sound that shattered the silence. My heart skipped, the sudden noise too loud in the stillness. But there was no turning back now. I stepped onto the path leading to the front door. It wasn't just that the house was dark. It was that it felt wrong. The air felt thicker here, the shadows deeper, as though the very walls were alive with something unspeakable. I stood in front of the door, my hand hovering over the handle. It was cool to the touch, slick with condensation, but it didn't feel like any normal door. It felt heavy, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for me to make the first move. Without thinking, I turned the handle and pushed the door open. The hinges groaned, and the door swung inward with a sharp, metallic screech. The hallway beyond was black, an abyss that seemed to stretch on forever. I could barely make out the outlines of the furniture, their shapes distorted in the dim moonlight that filtered through the windows. The air inside was thick with dust and the scent of something old, stale, like the house had been sitting in silence for far longer than it should have. I stepped inside, my footfall muffled by the thick carpet. The door slammed shut behind me, and I jumped, my pulse racing. Everything inside was still. No movement. No sound. But I could feel something. Something watching me. It was in the air, in the walls, in the very floor beneath my feet. My skin prickled, my hair standing on end as I slowly advanced deeper into the house. The temperature seemed to drop with each step I took. My breath came out in visible puffs, but the chill wasn't just from the cold. It felt wrong, like the air itself was pushing against me, trying to force me out. I reached the living room, or what used to be the living room. The furniture was covered in layers of dust, the windows clouded with grime, but it wasn't the decay that caught my attention. It was the silence. The way the air seemed to swallow up any noise, as if the house was too full, too heavy with memories that it couldn't let go of. And then, I heard it. A soft creak. A floorboard, somewhere deeper inside the house. I froze. The house wasn't empty. Not at all. Slowly, I turned my head toward the source of the noise. My heartbeat quickened as I listened, straining to hear anything else. But all I could hear was the sound of my own breath, too loud in my ears. There it was again. A faint shuffle, like someone moving through the house. It was too deliberate, too careful. "Hello?" I whispered, but the word felt too small in the vast emptiness of the house. It felt pathetic. No answer. Just the faint sound of movement, closer now. I could feel my pulse in my throat. Sweat beaded on my forehead. I wanted to scream, to run, but something deep inside me held me in place. This was it. This was the moment I had been dreading. The figure. The voice. The eyes. They were all here, in this house. And whatever it was getting closer. I turned slowly, my eyes searching the shadows, but there was nothing. No one. The house felt emptier than ever, as though it had consumed whatever had been there before. But then I heard it again. A low whisper, this time coming from behind me. "Stay with us." The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. The room was still empty. But the voice, it had come from within the walls, like a part of the house itself was speaking. I had no choice now. I had to move. Had to get out. But as I turned to leave, the front door slammed shut again, trapping me inside. And that was when I realized I wasn't alone. Not by a long shot. Have you ever blinked and felt like you missed something? Not just a few seconds, but an entire moment, like the world around you has skipped ahead without you? It started happening to me a few weeks ago, and at first, I thought it was just exhaustion. A quick slip of the mind, nothing to worry about. But now, every time I blink, every time I close my eyes for even the shortest moment, it's like I lose a part of time. And no one around me seems to notice. It's a strange feeling, watching life unfold while knowing that some pieces of it are missing. I'm sure I'm not imagining it. My friends, my coworkers, even strangers, everyone continues as if nothing is amiss, as if I didn't just lose a few moments of my life. It's happening more often now. And no matter how hard I try to keep my focus, it's getting harder to tell when I lose those precious seconds. The gaps are small at first, barely noticeable, like a skip in a song. But they're growing. I remember the first time it happened. I was sitting at my desk, working. My computer screen was filled with numbers and notes, nothing out of the ordinary. I blinked. Just a regular blink, no different than any other. But when I opened my eyes again, the room was quieter. The clock on the wall read a different time than I remembered. Not by much, just a minute or two. But it was enough to make me pause. I thought it was nothing. Just a glitch in my brain, maybe. But it happened again. And again. Until I couldn't ignore it anymore. I wasn't the only one who noticed, though. A few days ago, my friend Mark asked me if I'd been feeling okay lately. He said I seemed a little off, a little distant. But I hadn't told him about the time skips. He wouldn't believe me. How could he? How could anyone? At night, it's worse. I've started waking up in the middle of the night, my heart racing, drenched in sweat. The sheets are tangled around me, and for a moment, I'm disoriented, unsure of where I am. The darkness in my room feels thicker somehow, as if it's hiding something just out of reach. I've started to notice things. Small things that weren't there before. A shadow lingering too long in the corner of my room. The faint smell of something burning, even though nothing is on fire. And the voices. Quiet at first, but always there, just outside of my hearing range. Like whispers that never fully reach my ears, but they're there, waiting, always waiting. I tell myself I'm just imagining things. That I'm tired, stressed, anything to explain it away. But then, when I blink again, I feel it, a moment has slipped by. And the world has moved on without me. Last night, I stayed awake, forcing myself to stay alert, to catch it in the act. I stared at the clock, willing the seconds to slow down. But it happened anyway. I closed my eyes for just a moment, just long enough to blink, and when I opened them again, the minute hand had moved. 5 minutes had passed. Just like that. But the strangest part? There was no one else around. There was no one to witness it. Just me and the feeling that I was losing something. I'm beginning to wonder if I'm losing more than just time. What if it's not just my perception? What if I'm being manipulated like a puppet with strings pulled by someone or something else? My mind races at the thought. But then, as quickly as it comes, it's gone, swallowed up by that all-encompassing silence. And I can't stop thinking about it. About the things I'm missing. About the seconds that are slipping away. There's a dull ache in the back of my mind now, a growing sense that something is very wrong. But no one else sees it. No one else hears it. Maybe they're all in on it. Maybe they know exactly what's happening, and they're just pretending nothing's wrong. But I don't think so. I think they're just as clueless as I am. Tonight, I'll try again. I'll keep my eyes open longer. I'll watch more closely. Because I know something's happening. Something I can't explain. Something that's changing the way time works. And I need to find out what it is. Because if I don't, I might wake up one day and realize I've missed something far more important than just a few seconds. I couldn't sleep that night. I lay in my bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence that filled the room. The air felt thick, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The darkness outside my window seemed to press against the glass, as if trying to squeeze its way in. It was around 2 in the morning when it happened again. I blinked. I swear I only blinked. Just a quick flash of my eyelids. But when I opened them, the world around me had shifted. I looked at the clock. 2:05 a.m. But that wasn't the worst part. I had already looked at the clock before, just seconds ago, maybe less. And it had read 1:58 a.m. I couldn't move. The weight of the realization hit me all at once. I hadn't just missed a few seconds. I had missed minutes. An entire chunk of time had vanished, like it had been swallowed by the night. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. My hands were shaking as I reached for my phone, hoping to confirm what I had seen. The screen lit up, but the time displayed was no different from the clock on my wall. 2:05 a.m. I tried to steady my breath, forcing myself to think clearly. It could still be a mistake. A trick of the light, a glitch in my brain. Maybe I had just forgotten looking at the clock. Maybe I was just tired. But the more I thought about it, the more the unease settled in. I looked around the room, trying to focus on something familiar. But nothing felt quite right. The shadows seemed deeper, more active, like they were moving just out of the corner of my eyes. I told myself it was nothing. Just the way the night light cast itself in strange ways. But then I heard it. A faint sound from the hallway outside my bedroom door. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, the usual creaks of old wood. But this sound, it was different. It was a soft shuffle, like footsteps, but hesitant. Almost like someone was walking slowly, deliberately. I held my breath, waiting for it to stop, for the sound to fade away. But it didn't. It continued. Step. Pause. Step. Pause. I swallowed hard. It was coming closer. Slowly but steadily, the footsteps grew louder, and I realized I was paralyzed. My body, frozen in place, as if the sound had rooted me to the bed. I strained my ears, trying to hear something else, anything else, but the footsteps were the only thing that existed in the room. Then, the air shifted again. The temperature dropped. A chill crept across my skin, seeping into the bones beneath. The quiet became unbearable, and the footsteps stopped right outside my door. I couldn't see anything. The hallway outside was cloaked in darkness. The only thing I could hear was my own breathing, shallow and quick. I wanted to get up, to move, to scream, but my body refused to obey. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the door. It was as if something, or someone, was waiting for me. And then, in the deep silence that followed, something shifted. The footsteps began again, but this time they weren't alone. Another set of footsteps joined in, moving in tandem with the first, as if two people were now standing there, just beyond the threshold. I waited, but no one entered. The minutes dragged on, each second heavier than the last. And yet, no one came in. No one knocked. No voice, no face, no explanation. I don't know how long I stayed like that, my heart pounding, eyes fixed on the door. It could have been hours, or just moments. But at some point, the footsteps faded, and the air around me returned to its normal, oppressive stillness. I didn't move until the first light of dawn began to creep through the edges of my blinds. The room was the same. Nothing had changed. The clock still read 2:05 a.m., the same time it had shown since the moment I first blinked. But everything felt wrong. It wasn't just the footsteps, or the darkness, or the cold that still clung to my skin. It was something deeper. Something I couldn't explain. The time had passed, and yet I hadn't moved. I hadn't left my bed. I hadn't even gotten up. The missing seconds were more than just time slipping away. It was as if I was being erased. Like I wasn't meant to be part of the world anymore, like the gaps in time were taking me with them, piece by piece. I got up finally, my legs stiff and weak. The room felt too quiet. Too still. I needed to do something, anything, to break the silence. So, I grabbed my jacket and headed out the door. I needed to go for a walk. To clear my mind. To find something solid to hold on to. But as I stepped outside, I noticed something else. The world had changed. Not drastically, but enough. The streets were quieter than usual. There were fewer cars. Fewer people. The shops were still closed, but the usual hum of early morning life was absent. I looked around, trying to shake off the creeping sense of dread that had settled over me. Maybe I was just overthinking things. Maybe it was just the lack of sleep or the stress at work. But when I passed by a small cafe, I saw a man sitting inside, his face pressed against the window, staring at me. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and they followed me as I walked past. He didn't look away. I stopped. My heart skipped a beat. He wasn't just watching me. He was waiting. And in that moment, I realized something I hadn't considered before. What if the time I had lost wasn't just mine? What if everyone else had moved forward while I was left behind? What if they had noticed something I hadn't? I turned back toward the cafe, but when I looked inside again, the man was gone. Just like the seconds I had lost. The walk didn't help. The fresh air didn't clear my mind. If anything, it only made things worse. The more I tried to focus on something ordinary, anything familiar, the more I realized that nothing felt right. The streets, the shops, the people all seemed like half-formed versions of themselves, as if they were just waiting to be filled in. I could almost hear the tick of an invisible clock, counting down, but I had no idea what I was waiting for. I kept thinking about the man at the cafe, his eyes glued to me as I passed. There was something unsettling in the way he had stared, as if he knew something I didn't. Maybe he had noticed the missing time too. Maybe he was waiting for me to notice it. I needed to talk to someone. I had to find someone who could explain what was happening to me. Maybe it wasn't just me. Maybe everyone had experienced these strange gaps, these seconds that slipped through the cracks. I turned towards the nearest phone booth, a dim and dusty thing that sat awkwardly on the corner. It felt like an odd relic of the past, out of place in the present, but I needed to call someone. Anyone. I dialed my brother's number. He always picked up. But this time, it rang longer than usual. Too long. Almost as if the phone was waiting, too. The voice on the other end startled me. "Hello?" It was his voice. But it wasn't right. It sounded too calm, too disinterested. "Dan?" I said, almost breathlessly. "Dan, something's wrong. I need your help. I can't explain it, but time is. There was a pause. I could hear him breathing, but it was steady, unmoved. And then he spoke in that same distant tone. "What are you talking about? Time is fine. You're just tired. You should get some rest." I opened my mouth to respond, but he cut me off. "I'll come over later, all right? Just relax." The line clicked, and then the dial tone echoed in my ear. I stood there, stunned. It wasn't just what he had said. It was the way he had said it. As if I were the one who was crazy. As if nothing had changed, nothing was wrong. And yet, I could feel it in my bones. I could feel the missing time pressing against me, pulling me down. I tried to shake it off, but my mind kept circling back to that moment at the cafe. The man with the unblinking eyes. I had to go back there. I had to understand what he knew, what he had seen. Maybe I was the only one who had noticed. Or maybe there was something else happening here. Something that I was only beginning to grasp. I turned around and made my way back to the cafe. The streets seemed even emptier now. The usual hustle of morning commuters had disappeared, replaced by an eerie stillness. The faint rustle of leaves was the only sound, but even that felt muted, like the world itself was holding its breath. As I reached the cafe, I felt the first stirrings of dread. It wasn't just the emptiness that unsettled me, it was the quiet, the unnatural quiet. The man should still be inside. He had to be. I needed answers, and he was the only one who could give them to me. I pushed open the door, the bell above it jingling softly. Inside, the tables were empty. The barista wasn't behind the counter. The lights flickered, casting strange shadows across the room. But there was no sign of the man. Not even his lingering gaze through the window. I scanned the room, my eyes moving quickly from corner to corner, but he was nowhere to be found. The seat where he had sat was still warm, as if he had just left. A half-empty cup of coffee sat on the table, untouched, the steam barely rising from it. But it wasn't just the empty seat that caught my attention. On the floor, near the back of the cafe, there was something I hadn't noticed before. A small piece of paper, crumpled and stained, lying just beneath one of the chairs. I bent down to pick it up, my fingers trembling as I unfolded it. The writing was messy, hurried, and barely legible, but I could make out the words. "You're not the only one." I stared at the note, my mind racing. What did it mean? Who had written it? And why was it here, of all places? A sudden noise behind me made me freeze. I whipped around, my heart pounding, but there was nothing there. Just the empty chairs and tables. The silence felt oppressive, suffocating. I stepped back toward the door, but then I heard it again, a soft shuffle of footsteps. But they weren't coming from the door. They were coming from the back of the cafe, from the narrow hallway that led to the staff room. I took a deep breath and walked toward it, every step heavy with hesitation. My hand shook as I reached for the doorknob, and for a moment, I considered turning back. But something urged me on. Something told me that the answers I needed were waiting for me just beyond that door. I turned the knob and pushed it open. The room beyond was dark, but there was a faint light coming from a small lamp in the corner. The shadows stretched long across the floor, and I could make out the faint outline of something or someone sitting in the corner. I stepped inside, my feet echoing too loudly in the small space. The figure didn't move. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its eyes on me. "Hello?" I whispered, my voice hoarse, uncertain. No response. I took another step forward, and that's when I saw it. A reflection in the dark window. A face. But it wasn't mine. It was the man from the cafe. And he was smiling. A chill ran down my spine, and I backed away slowly, but as I did, the figure shifted. It stood up, its movements too smooth, too precise. As if it had been waiting for me. And then, as if in response to some unspoken signal, the lights went out. The missing seconds were closing in on me again. I froze, the darkness swallowing me whole. The absence of light wasn't just physical, it felt oppressive, as though the air itself had thickened, pressing in from all sides. My heart raced. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel the figure moving, its presence unmistakable. I stumbled backward, my palms searching for the walls, anything to ground me in reality. But the walls weren't where I remembered them. My hands brushed past smooth surfaces where there should have been edges, and the room felt larger, stretched out of shape. I gasped, trying to control my breathing. I couldn't lose control now. The darkness was the least of my worries. I had to find the door, I had to get out. But then the footsteps came again. Soft, deliberate. Closer. Closer. I spun, frantically scanning the blackness for any hint of movement, any sign of the thing that was now stalking me in this suffocating void. Step. 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 It was as if the sound of its feet on the floor had replaced all other noise. There was no hum of the city outside, no distant sounds of traffic or people. Just the steady rhythm of these footsteps, getting closer with each beat. I took a step forward, stumbling in the dark, my hand reaching out desperately. I needed to find the door. I needed to get out of this place. The air was colder now, and I could see my breath fogging in front of me, but it wasn't from the chill. It was the kind of cold that wrapped itself around your heart, squeezing tighter with every breath. I felt something wet on the back of my neck. A breath, or maybe just the air from a movement too close. Whisper. A voice. It was barely audible, but I heard it, clear as day. "You can't leave." I spun around, my pulse quickening. There was no one there. The room was still empty, still silent except for the thudding of my own heart. But then I realized something. The smell. The air smelled wrong. It wasn't the usual stale scent of old furniture or coffee. It was something darker, more metallic, like blood. It clung to the inside of my nose, made my stomach churn. I backed away from the wall and, in my panic, crashed into something. No, someone. I jerked away, but there was no immediate reaction. No movement. I didn't even hear the sound of feet on the floor anymore. It was like I'd collided with a statue. Frozen. I reached out, hesitantly, toward whatever I hit. My hand brushed against fabric, but it was too still, too cold to be human. I pulled my hand back, anxiety clawing at my chest. "Hello?" My voice sounded weak in the void. I didn't know why I was asking. I knew there would be no answer. Then, the lights flickered. For a moment, just a brief flash, I saw something. A face. The same man from the cafe, his eyes wide, his mouth moving. But there was no sound, no words. His lips were forming shapes that didn't match the rhythm of my heartbeat. The light flickered again. And then, just as quickly, everything was dark again. My pulse thudded in my ears. I had to get out. I couldn't stay here. But as I turned towards the door, I saw it. The thing, the man, was standing in front of me. His face was closer now, so close I could feel his breath on my skin, cold and unnatural. The smile was wide, stretching impossibly far across his face, revealing sharp, jagged teeth. The more I stared, the more I saw. His eyes were wide, yes, but not in fear. They were empty. Hollow. You saw it too, his voice echoed in my mind, not from his lips. It wasn't him speaking. It was as if the words were just inserted into my thoughts. You saw what we are, didn't you? I wanted to scream, but my throat was tight. It felt as though the air around me had thickened to the point where I could hardly breathe. You think this is your world, the voice continued, but it isn't. Not anymore. I tried to step back, but I was rooted to the spot. It was like gravity itself had turned against me, pressing me into the ground. My eyes darted around, searching for any escape, but there was nowhere to go. The walls closed in, narrowing around me like a trap. I realized something then. I wasn't just trapped in this room. I wasn't even trapped in this moment. I had been trapped in this time. Every second, every breath, every movement, it was a cycle. It was all repeating. I had seen it before. I had felt it before. This sensation of being caught between spaces, of not being able to catch up, of jumping ahead without even knowing. The world, it was twisting, bending. It wasn't real. None of it was. The man stepped closer, and my vision blurred, as if the room was breaking apart, or maybe I was. His hands, thin, bony fingers, reached out for me, but then everything stopped. A jarring sound broke the illusion, the lights flickered again, and the cafe was normal again. No dark figure. No smiling man. Just empty chairs and a clean, bright space. I blinked, unsure if the shift in reality had been real, if I had imagined the man, if I had imagined all of it. But then, in the corner of the room, there was the note. The crumpled piece of paper, still on the floor, just like before. And this time, there was more writing. We're all waiting. You'll see soon enough. The words were etched in jagged letters, like they had been scratched into the paper with force. My heart pounded in my chest, and I backed out of the cafe, unable to look away from the note. The door closed behind me with a sharp click, and I stood outside, my mind racing. The seconds, the missing seconds, they weren't gone. They were just waiting. Waiting for me to catch up. But I wasn't sure I could. I couldn't breathe. The note haunted me. It sat in my mind like a splinter, something small but sharp, twisting with every passing second. My legs felt weak as I stood outside the cafe, the world around me moving at its usual pace, cars honking, people laughing, street vendors shouting, but I felt detached, a stranger in my own skin. I glanced around, hoping for something to ground me, something familiar, but nothing felt right. The sky seemed too bright, the air too thin. My heartbeat was the loudest thing in my head. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the door, frozen in place. The noise of the city became muffled, distant, like I was underwater. All I could think about was that note. We're all waiting. You'll see soon enough. I didn't know what it meant, but it made sense in a way that I couldn't explain. It was as if there was something hidden just below the surface, something I was meant to see, but it was slipping through my fingers. I couldn't chase it. I couldn't catch it. I started walking, my feet moving before I even realized. The path was familiar. The old bookstore on the corner. The park where I used to go when I needed to think. But everything felt wrong. Each step I took felt like it was on the wrong side of the world, like I was moving backward through my own life. The sound of footsteps behind me was subtle at first. So quiet, I almost thought I had imagined it. But then it grew louder. Step by step, until I knew it wasn't just in my head. I turned quickly, my eyes scanning the street, but there was no one there. No one in sight. Just a few pedestrians walking along the sidewalk, their faces blurry, their movements out of sync with the flow of time. And then, the air shifted. It was a subtle change at first, like a draft slipping through the cracks of reality. But it deepened, turned heavier, colder. The shadows were longer. I glanced around, feeling the weight of their presence, like they were pressing against me. The shadows of the buildings stretched unnaturally long, twisting into shapes that didn't belong. I stumbled forward, trying to shake the feeling, but I was moving slower now, like the world around me had decided to move at a different pace. My feet didn't lift off the ground properly. It was as if I were walking underwater, each step harder than the last. The sound of footsteps was getting closer. I looked behind me again. Still no one. But then, from the corner of my eye, I saw something, a flicker of movement in the shadows. Something tall and slender, just outside my field of vision, darting in and out of view. I couldn't quite make it out, but I felt it. It was watching me. The air around me turned even colder. My breath was now visible, floating in front of me, but it wasn't from the chill. It was the kind of cold that creeps beneath the skin, that sinks into your bones and chills your soul. I tried to shake it off, but the weight of it stayed with me. I turned another corner, hoping to lose whatever was following me, but the streets felt distorted, unfamiliar. The buildings were too tall. The sky was too dark. And every person I passed, their faces were wrong. They weren't real. Their eyes were hollow, distant. Their movements jerky, like poorly synchronized puppets. Step. 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 The footsteps were louder now. So close I could feel them at the back of my neck, breathing down my spine. I broke into a run, the pavement slapping against my shoes, but it didn't matter. The sound followed, matching my pace. I looked up again, hoping for some sign of relief, but there was nothing. The world around me seemed to warp, the edges of reality bending and stretching. Everything felt unreal, like a dream I couldn't wake up from. And then, I saw it. A figure standing at the end of the alley. Taller than a person. Almost too tall. It was just a silhouette, its features hidden in shadow, but there was something about it that froze me in place. It wasn't human. I could feel it in my gut, in the way the air thickened around it. I stood there, paralyzed, unable to look away. The thing didn't move, but I could sense it growing closer, the air around me becoming suffocating. The footsteps, my footsteps, the world, it all stopped. It was as if time had paused. And then it spoke. Its voice was like a crackling fire, distant and broken, but it filled the air around me. "You know," it said, "this isn't the first time. You've seen this before. You've been here before. The words hit me like a slap, the weight of their meaning sinking in. I didn't understand, but I could feel it. I had been here before. In this moment. In this place. And it wasn't the first time I had felt this. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to run, to scream, to wake up, but my body wouldn't obey. I was trapped. Not just in this moment, but in something far deeper. The figure took a step forward. I could see it clearer now. Its shape was twisted, elongated, a blur of darkness that stretched impossibly tall, too tall for anything human. But its face was familiar. A broken reflection of my own. It grinned. A horrible, unnatural grin that stretched far too wide, its eyes black holes. "You're not meant to leave," it whispered, the words sliding into my mind like poison. "You can't escape. Not now." I tried to move, tried to scream, but it was too late. I was already lost. It started with a cry. At first, I thought I was imagining it. It was late, too late for any normal noise to be coming from my neighbor's apartment. But then I heard it again. A soft, faint wail. The kind only a baby could make. And yet, there were no children in that apartment. I had lived here for over a year, and the place next door had always been quiet. Too quiet. I pressed my ear against the wall, straining to hear through the thin drywall. The crying wasn't consistent, but it was loud enough to make my heart race. It was unmistakable. A baby crying for attention. But why? Why would I hear it, and why couldn't anyone else? I pulled back, my pulse quickening. It was just a sound. Maybe someone had brought a child over, or maybe I had just imagined it. But the feeling that came with it wasn't so easily dismissed. There was something unnerving about hearing a baby cry in the middle of the night when you knew no baby lived next door. The next night, I heard it again. And the next. Each time, it felt more real. The sound was clearer now, more distinct, almost too real. But still, there was nothing unusual when I went outside. No sign of children, no sign of life, nothing that could explain the crying. It became impossible to ignore. I started staying up late, hoping to hear it again. I didn't know why I wanted to, but there was something pulling me toward that sound, something that kept me awake, waiting. I knocked on the door next door one evening, fully expecting to find an explanation. Maybe the neighbors had a baby, and I just didn't know about it. But the woman who answered was surprised to see me. "Is everything okay?" she asked, glancing nervously behind her. I felt stupid. What was I even going to say? I've been hearing something. A baby crying. I thought I heard it coming from your apartment. Her eyes widened, but she quickly recovered, a forced smile spreading across her face. "No, there's no baby here. You must be hearing things. It's probably just the wind, or maybe your imagination." I nodded awkwardly, backing away. I didn't want to sound crazy, but the crying was real. I knew what I heard. The woman closed the door a little too quickly, almost as if she was eager to end the conversation. But something in the way she avoided my gaze, it made my skin crawl. That night, as I lay in bed, the crying returned. Louder this time, more desperate. My heart pounded in my chest as I sat up, listening carefully. It was coming from the wall, just on the other side of my bedroom. I had to do something. I couldn't just let it go on. I stood up and walked to the wall, placing my hand on the cold, unyielding surface. The cries grew louder. It was as if something was on the other side, trapped. My hand pressed harder against the wall, almost as if I could feel the desperation through the drywall. "Help me," a voice whispered. It was soft, barely audible, but it sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't the cry of a baby anymore. It was a voice, human, but not quite. My breath caught in my throat. I stepped back, unsure of what I had just heard. I had to be imagining it. I had to be. But as the seconds ticked by, the voice grew clearer. "Please, help me." I couldn't move. My feet were rooted to the spot. The voice was so real, so raw, it felt like someone was standing right there beside me. But no one was. I ran to the door and threw it open, hoping the fresh air would clear my head. The night outside was still, but the unease in my chest remained. The silence felt off, like it was waiting for something. I leaned against the doorframe, trying to steady my breathing. This couldn't be happening. It had to be a trick of my mind. But deep down, I knew the voice was real. And whatever it was trying to tell me something. As I stood there, I noticed something strange. The shadows in the hallway seemed to shift, growing longer, darker. A movement out of the corner of my eye, something that shouldn't be there, something I couldn't fully see. I slammed the door shut, my heart racing again. The shadows in my apartment felt different now. Heavier. The walls seemed to pulse with an eerie energy, as if something was pressing against them, wanting to break through. The crying stopped. For a moment, everything was still. But the silence didn't comfort me. It felt oppressive, like the calm before a storm. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was behind that wall. Something that wasn't meant to be there. And it wanted help. But what kind of help could I give it? I pressed my ear to the wall once more, but this time there was no cry. Only the faint echo of something shifting. Something moving on the other side. The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The apartment felt off, like a presence lingered just out of sight. The walls seemed thicker, more suffocating, as if the air itself was heavier. I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt so uneasy in my own home. I tried to tell myself that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. The night had been long, and the whisper, the crying, it must have been a hallucination. Stress. Anxiety. Overactive imagination. That was all. But deep down, I knew I was lying to myself. I couldn't explain what happened, and it gnawed at me relentlessly. As the day went on, I couldn't focus. I found myself pacing, staring at the wall that separated my apartment from the one next door. Every so often, I would stop, press my palm against it, listening for anything. But nothing. Not a sound. Only silence. The kind of silence that made your skin crawl. I decided to take a walk, hoping the fresh air would clear my head. The streets outside were busy, people going about their daily routines, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That there was something following me, just beyond the edge of my vision. I turned around a few times, half expecting to see someone or something behind me. But nothing. When I returned home, I didn't feel any better. The silence in my apartment was even more oppressive. I could feel it pressing down on me, suffocating me. I sat down at my kitchen table, trying to gather my thoughts, but every creak of the floorboards, Every slight shift of air made my pulse quicken. I couldn't relax. That night, as the sun set and darkness crept in, the crying returned. At first, it was faint, almost like a distant memory, just on the edge of my hearing. But then it grew louder, sharper. A baby's wail. I could almost picture it now, the tiny, helpless creature crying for someone, for help. But where was it? It couldn't be coming from the neighbors. There was no baby next door. So where was it coming from? I felt the familiar tug in my chest, the compulsion to investigate. I stood up, my legs shaky beneath me, and walked toward the wall. I placed my hand against it once more, listening. The cry stopped. I pulled my hand back, confused. Had I imagined it? Was it really that loud, or was my mind playing tricks again? But then, through the stillness, I heard something. A whisper. Soft at first, almost drowned out by the silence, but then clearer. Help me. The voice was unmistakable. It was the same voice from before, the voice that wasn't a baby's cry anymore, but something human. Something desperate. Something trapped. I pressed my ear to the wall, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. The whisper was louder now, closer. The sound of it sent chills down my spine, but I couldn't move. I was frozen, trapped in place by the voice that seemed to come from inside me, like it was speaking directly into my mind. Please, help me. I took a step back, my breath quickening, my palms sweating. What the hell was happening? There had to be a logical explanation, right? Some sort of wiring issue? A pipe or vent that made it sound like there was a voice on the other side of the wall? But no, I couldn't convince myself. I knew what I heard. I grabbed the nearest object, an old broom I'd left in the corner, and knocked gently against the wall. 3 quick taps. The crying stopped immediately. For a moment, everything was still. I thought, maybe, just maybe, that would be the end of it. But then, I heard something else. A soft scraping sound, as though someone was moving on the other side. I couldn't see them, but I could almost feel them. The scratching sound grew louder, more frantic, as though they were trying to break through the wall. My heart raced in my chest. I backed away, my legs shaking. My breath came in shallow gasps. This couldn't be real. It couldn't. But then came the words again, louder this time, more urgent. Please, help me. I don't want to be alone anymore. I felt a cold rush of air sweep through the room, and suddenly, the shadows in my apartment felt thicker, darker. They seemed to grow, to stretch out toward me like fingers reaching out from the walls. The room seemed to shrink, as though the space itself was closing in around me. I ran to the door and threw it open, gasping for air. But the hallway outside was dark, empty, silent. No one was there. There was nothing that could explain what was happening. The crying had stopped. The whispering had stopped. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something was just waiting. I stood in the doorway, staring at the darkness of the hallway. Every inch of my apartment felt like it was pressing in on me, suffocating me. I wanted to leave. I wanted to get out of there. But I couldn't. Something was keeping me here. Something I couldn't explain, but it was real. I knew it was real. I turned back into the apartment, and that's when I saw it. A shadow. A figure, standing motionless at the end of the hallway, just out of reach of the dim light. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its gaze on me. And I heard the voice again, not from the wall, not from the shadows, but from somewhere deeper within the room. Help me. I was no longer sure if the walls could keep what was inside them contained. I couldn't breathe. My mind was spinning, unable to process the absurdity of it all. A figure? In my apartment? No, that wasn't possible. My eyes must have been playing tricks on me, or the shadows had distorted into something human. I wanted to run, to escape from whatever this nightmare had become, but my feet were glued to the floor, as though the room itself had grown roots, anchoring me in place. The figure stood there, tall, still, and impossibly silent. I wanted to scream, but the sound was trapped somewhere deep inside me, choked by my own fear. For a moment, it felt like time itself had frozen, and all that remained was the dark shape looming at the far end of the hall. I couldn't make out its features, but something about it felt wrong. So wrong. The whisper came again, but this time it wasn't from the walls. It wasn't a distant sound, a voice creeping from the other side. No, it came from within the room, closer, almost as if the very air was speaking to me. Please, help me. I flinched, my pulse hammering in my ears. The words, soft and desperate, crawled beneath my skin like an insidious itch. They weren't just words. They were a plea. A cry for help that demanded to be answered. I forced myself to take a step back, only to realize that I was no longer in the hallway. The hallway had disappeared. I was standing in the center of my living room, surrounded by the oppressive weight of silence. My apartment no longer looked familiar, no longer felt like home. The walls seemed to stretch, grew tall and narrow, bending around me. The air was thick, suffocating, pressing in on my chest like the weight of an ocean. The shadows didn't just linger in corners, they swirled, moving as if alive. And then it came again, the sound of something scraping against the walls. Slow at first, like nails dragging across the surface, but soon it picked up speed. The walls themselves seemed to groan, as if something was trying to push through from the other side. I looked around, desperately searching for an escape, but there was none. The room was closing in on me. The air turned colder, sharper, and I could see my breath now, clouds of vapor in the dim light. I turned back toward the hallway, expecting the figure to still be there. But it was gone. Instead, I saw only the darkness, a void that seemed to reach out and swallow everything it touched. And then I heard the crying again. It wasn't from the walls this time. No, the sound was all around me. The sharp, guttural wail of a child in distress. The cry of a baby, no, not a baby. A child. The kind of cry that no parent could ignore. But there were no children in the building. There were no babies next door. The sound was coming from within the apartment, from deep inside the walls. I moved toward the sound, my legs trembling beneath me. Each step felt like I was sinking into quicksand. The closer I got to the wall, the more intense the cry became. It was a noise that crawled under my skin, tugging at something deep inside of me. A primal instinct I couldn't control. I reached out, my hand trembling as I placed it on the cold surface of the wall. And then, nothing. The crying stopped. Just like before, when I knocked on the wall. But this time, the silence felt different. Heavy. And the shadows, they moved. I pulled my hand away, my heart thundering in my chest. A sound like wood cracking echoed in the room. And then I saw it. A crack. A small, thin line in the wall right where I had been standing. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, something my brain was inventing to explain the horror that had been unfolding. But no, this crack, it was real. It widened, slowly, inch by inch, until the sound of it echoed in the stillness. From the crack, something crawled out. Something not quite human. I couldn't see it clearly at first, but I could hear it. The rustling, the soft scraping, as though it was inching its way toward me. Then, a voice, low, rasping, filled with desperation. Please. I just want to be free. I stumbled backward, my feet catching on the rug as I fell to the floor. My heart was racing, my mind screaming for me to run, to get out of there. But the crack was widening, and something was coming through it. The room seemed to warp around me. The walls creaked as though they were alive, groaning under the weight of whatever was emerging from them. The shadows twisted, coiled like serpents, and I could feel the temperature in the room drop further until my breath was a visible mist in the air. And then I saw it. A face. Pale and gaunt, with eyes too wide, too empty. Its mouth stretched into a smile that didn't belong on a human face. It moved slowly, deliberately, as though savoring the fear in my eyes. Please. It whispered again, help me. I wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. I was paralyzed, locked in place, unable to tear my gaze away from the creature. The air around me seemed to hum with a strange, unnatural energy. I could hear the faint echoes of something, of footsteps, from the other side of the wall. It was as if the apartment itself had become a vessel, filled with echoes of things that didn't belong. Things that were never meant to be heard. The creature, if it could even be called that, stepped fully out of the wall now, its body unnaturally long and distorted. Its limbs were too thin, like twigs that had been bent and snapped into place. It didn't move like a person, but like a marionette, jerking and twitching with each step. It leaned down toward me, its breath cold against my skin. Please. It whispered again. Help me, before it's too late. And then the room went dark. Everything went silent. No shadows, no whispers. Just the unbearable weight of nothingness pressing down on me. I didn't know if I was still alive, or if I ever had been. I woke up with a gasp, my chest heaving as though I had been running for hours. The room was dark, too dark. I blinked, disoriented, my mind trying to grasp onto something familiar. But everything was wrong. I was on the floor, not in my bed. The cold, smooth surface beneath me felt like concrete, not carpet. The walls, the ceiling, everything had changed. I couldn't even tell if I was in my apartment anymore. The silence was suffocating. Not the quiet that came with an empty room, but a heavy, pressing stillness that seemed to wrap around me like a blanket. I tried to stand, but my legs were weak, as though they didn't belong to me. I forced myself up, my hands scraping against the unfamiliar ground. I couldn't understand what had happened. The last thing I remembered was that creature. Its smile. Its voice. And then the darkness. It took a few moments for my eyes to adjust to the dim light coming from somewhere above. I looked around, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The apartment, my apartment, was gone. The walls were cracked, their surfaces peeling away in jagged lines that seemed to stretch far beyond what was physically possible. The floor, once covered with the soft carpet I had chosen carefully, was now rough, splintered wood, worn down by years of neglect. The ceiling, too, had fallen apart, revealing beams that seemed to bend unnaturally, as if they were holding up more than just the room above. But it wasn't the decay that terrified me, it was the whispers. Soft, almost imperceptible, but there. I could feel them crawling under my skin. Not voices I recognized. Not human voices. But something older. Something that had been here long before I had. Please, help me. I froze, the words searing through my mind. It was that voice again. That voice from the wall. That desperate, pleading voice that had filled me with terror before. But now, it wasn't coming from the walls. It wasn't coming from anywhere I could identify. It was everywhere. It was in my ears, in my mind, in the very air around me. I spun around, trying to locate the source of the sound. But there was nothing. Nothing except shadows, creeping and shifting in the corners of the room. I didn't know what was real anymore. My sense of space had warped, and I couldn't tell where the walls ended and the shadows began. I started walking, my steps slow and unsteady, as if the very ground beneath me was trying to pull me down into it. The whispers followed me, always just behind me, like 1,000 unseen eyes watching my every move. The air was thick with the smell of something rotting, something foul. But it wasn't just the scent that made my stomach churn, it was the feeling that something was breathing in alongside me. The room stretched out before me, impossibly large, as if the walls were moving further away the more I walked. The door, the one I had seen earlier, was gone. The hallway, the familiar hallway I had known so well, had turned into a void. A dark pit. The shadows seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm, as though the room itself was alive. The whispers grew louder, now echoing from every direction. There was no escape from them. I couldn't find the source. I couldn't tell if they were in my head or if the walls themselves were alive, speaking to me in a language I didn't understand. Please, don't leave me. Please help me. The words repeated over and over like a broken record, and they became louder with each repetition. I felt my sanity starting to unravel, my grip on reality slipping. The shadows were moving now, slithering across the floor, climbing the walls, creeping up toward me. My heart raced, my breath shallow, my chest tightening as though the very air was being squeezed out of me. I had to find a way out. I had to escape. I ran. I didn't know where I was going, but my feet carried me forward, my body moving on pure instinct. The room seemed to stretch endlessly in front of me, the walls closing in tighter with every step. I couldn't hear the whispers anymore, just the pounding of my own heart in my ears. But that didn't mean they were gone. I could feel them, watching me. And then I saw it. A crack, just like before. But this time, it wasn't in the wall. No, it was in the very fabric of the room itself, a tear, jagged and torn, leaking darkness. It was like a hole in the world. And from it, I could see something. Something moving. I took a step toward it, my mind screaming at me to stop, to turn around, to run. But my body betrayed me. I had to know. I had to see what was on the other side. The crack widened, the darkness spilling out like ink on paper, consuming everything in its path. And then I saw it, a face. A pale, twisted face, staring out at me from the blackness. I didn't want to look closer, but I couldn't pull away. It was a face, no, a mask of a child. But it was wrong. The eyes were too large, too hollow. The skin was stretched thin, almost translucent, like something that had been dead for years. Its mouth opened, and the words that came out were not the soft, pleading voice I had heard before. Help me. The crack in the room widened, and more figures began to emerge. More faces, more twisted, skeletal forms, their eyes fixed on me, their mouths opening, each one whispering the same words. "Help me! Help me!" The room began to spin, the walls shifting and bending on themselves. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The darkness was swallowing everything, my mind, my body, my soul. I was trapped. There was no escape. The world was spinning. My heart pounded like a drumbeat, echoing through my skull. I could feel the cold sweat soaking my skin, my hands trembling as I reached out to steady myself against the warped, rotting walls. The figures, the faces, they were everywhere now. I could hear them, feel them, pressing in from all sides. The room had ceased to exist in any logical way. The boundaries of reality were bending, warping like wet clay, and I was caught in the middle of it, unable to escape, unable to make sense of what was happening. Every shadow, every whisper seemed to carry its own weight, its own unspoken demand. "Help me!" The voice came again, clear this time, the plea laced with a kind of desperation that made my skin crawl. It wasn't the same as before. It wasn't distant anymore. It was right there. Inside my head. Inside my very soul. I tried to move, to run, but my legs felt like lead. The floor beneath me cracked, the wood splintering as though the entire room was crumbling under the pressure of the growing darkness. I staggered forward, desperate to find something, anything, to anchor myself to, but the crack, the hole in the world, was getting wider. And from that gap, more figures spilled out. The child's face, the one I had seen before, emerged again, its eyes wider than ever, more hollow. It grinned at me, but it wasn't a smile. No, it was something darker, something predatory. The edges of its features blurred, as if the face was slowly melting into something else. I wanted to scream. I wanted to beg for help, but my voice caught in my throat, as if the air had been sucked out of the room. The whispers grew louder. They weren't just whispers anymore. They were a chorus of voices, all demanding the same thing. "Help me. Please help me." I clutched my head, my fingers digging into my scalp as the voices thundered in my ears. It felt like they were coming from everywhere, from the walls, from the floor, from the ceiling. They were all around me, pressing in, suffocating me with their need, their agony. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I could hear was that voice. That damnable voice. The child's face twisted and stretched again, pulling into something monstrous. Its body began to emerge from the crack, the same warped, twisted form I had glimpsed before. Long, thin limbs, gnarled and skeletal, scraping the floor as it crawled toward me, its eyes locked onto mine, filled with a hunger that made my blood run cold. My legs moved on their own, dragging me backwards, away from the thing, away from the suffocating void that had consumed the room. I couldn't look away from its eyes. I couldn't stop myself from moving, even though every part of me screamed to run. "Help me." The voice came again, but now it was coming from inside my own mind. The walls trembled, the very foundations of this place shaking. The child, or whatever it was getting closer. Its long fingers reached out toward me, its face contorting in an unnatural way, stretching and bending like it was made of rubber. But the eyes were the only thing that stayed the same. Hollow, empty, and staring right through me. I stumbled backwards, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The room was no longer recognizable. The walls had morphed into something alien, the angles twisted in ways that defied reason. There was no door. No window. Nothing. Just the oppressive weight of the darkness closing in on me. I slammed into something. The crack in the wall. The hole. It was bigger now, wider, as if it was alive, expanding to swallow everything in its path. The faces, the figures, they were all staring at me from the depths of the blackness, their voices rising into a cacophony of despair. "Help me!" They screamed, their mouths opening impossibly wide, their voices shrill, high-pitched, but full of a longing that twisted my insides. I reached out instinctively, as if there was something in that blackness that could offer me an escape, a way out. My hand brushed against the edge of the tear in reality, and the instant I touched it, a searing pain shot through my arm. I screamed, but my voice was drowned out by the roar of the voices, the howling of the creatures emerging from the void. The pain in my arm intensified, like my skin was being torn apart, and I pulled my hand away, but it felt like something had latched onto me. Something had gotten inside me. The air was thick, suffocating. I could feel the walls pressing in, as though they were closing in on me, tightening around me. There was no way out. No escape. The shadows were swallowing everything, the faces of the children, and those things, coming closer, their hands reaching for me. "Help me." The words were louder now. I could feel them, deep inside my mind. I was being torn apart from the inside out, my sanity unraveling piece by piece. And then, with a final, deafening crack, the world exploded. Darkness. Absolute, crushing darkness. And then, nothing. For a moment, everything stopped. The voices, the creatures, the darkness, they were gone. There was no pain, no fear. Just an overwhelming emptiness. I opened my eyes. The room was back to normal. My apartment, my old apartment, was right there, untouched. The walls were intact, the floor clean, the air still. I blinked, trying to process what had just happened. My heart still raced in my chest, but I couldn't understand what had just occurred. Was it real? Had any of it been real? I stood up, my legs unsteady, my mind a whirl of confusion. But then, I heard it again. That voice. "Help me." It was coming from the wall. This has been a long, dark journey through the night with Whisper Crowley. Thank you for staying with us until the end. Leave a like if these stories made you look at the darkness a little differently, and share in the comments what you enjoyed most or what gave you chills. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss our next Sinister Whispers. Until we meet again in the world of shadows.